So, social side of development, anthropologists are starting to become more included in this process. Again, as countries and corporations move into these different areas, um, we're starting to kind of ask, who's going to be impacted, um, and the social impact assessment is basically when a study that is conducted to predict the potential social costs and benefits of particular innovations before the change is undertaken. So this is kind of a precursor to um, what happens uh, what happens with development, and then can we kind of like project that out to see what that's going to look like and who's going to be affected, right? Social capital, cultural capital, very important aspects of cultural anthropology. I've probably discussed them before. It's the intangible resources that exist through social ties, trust, and cooperation. A lot of these are used by grassroots organizations from around the world. So it's that making the human connection component. And it's really like what we're getting. We're getting trust and value out of those relationships. Multilateral institutions, several countries are used as donor members. The UN and the World Bank are part of these multilateral institutions. Bilateral institutions are those that involve a donor state and a recipient state. So that could also be that a specific country asks for a loan and then we loan them money. But remember, when we get into the money piece and debt, we really get into dependency, right? So we come to depend either on that money or or the debt, right, and the interest that we now kind of have or are making money on. So this is another component to remember in terms of development. Development project. So this is what what a project looks like, right? And this is going to be some fascinating stuff because this is much more applied anthropology. Development project is a set of activities designed to put development policies into action. Okay, so the project cycle itself is what it looks like over here on the right-hand side. Is steps of development from project identification, design, appraisal, implementation, and evaluation. And it also looks very similar to the policy process, right? So usually in the policy process, we identify a problem, then we propose different policy solutions, and then we implement, and then we evaluate, and then it kind of is this wheel that continues, right? Cultural fit, project design that takes local culture into account. I think this is interesting. I think I gave you guys the example of what happens in China, especially around this old ancient village in the middle of downtown Beijing that's scheduled to become skyscraping kind of apartment buildings and condos, and that those individuals were offered kind of this new spot in this skyscraper for free, right? But it got them to move, and now you can sell a bunch of different, houses and levels of houses. So it's kind of a compromise, right? You're giving up your old home, you're giving up your old kind of location, but if we always remember that change is a constant, then this is kind of a way of mitigating that. So this would be kind of a cultural fit, to be honest. Beijing doesn't look anything like it did, 500 years ago, or even a couple hundred years ago, to be honest. Traditional development anthropologists accept the role of helping by making the development work better by providing cultural information to planners. They become a cultural broker. It uses the donor kind of culture and recipient culture approach. So let's say that the hypothetical, right, that Coca-Cola wants to move into a rural place in Pakistan. They could technically use kind of applied cultural anthropologists to do the cultural broking, right? Like, all right, where are we going to put this plant? Who's it affecting? We're going to go out and talk to those individuals, see what they say, and then we'll take that information back to the developers. Critical development anthropology is going to be a more extreme version of that, and I would say the more activist kind of applied way, which is critical thinking role is anthropologists are involved at kind of the board of directors decision-making piece, right? So instead of the traditional development anthropologist is like they have a role of helping the developer kind of figure out how to navigate and whether or not it works. The critical development anthropologist is really going to take on a kind of a power role, and why and whose benefit the particular development and policies and programs are pursued, right? The critical development anthropologist is going to be, so in that same scenario, let's say that Coca-Cola says we're going to move into this rural Pakistan place. Critical development anthropologists would go out and look at that and then ultimately come back and say, no, we're not doing that. That's going to harm the local population. You're going to invest a bunch of money in that location. It's going to be shut down in 2 years. And I would say that a traditional development anthropologist is much more of a mitigator, a cultural broker. Like, what do we have to give them in order for them to build let us build the Coca-Cola factory, And critical development anthropology is not necessarily that cultural broker role. It's more like, we're not going to do this, right? We're just not. Colonialism and imperialism's effect. Indigenous groups have been destroyed by disease, relocation, and slavery. So this is, again, this is one of those things where a lot of activist anthropologists come involved as well. And we're going to talk a lot about those kind of groups and where they're happening currently. So knowing that indigenous groups are basically forced out because there's less power in terms of weaponry, military. Remember, they're mostly foraging hunter-gatherer groups that are sitting in the middle of a forest somewhere and don't really have any place to go. But big companies are coming in saying that they're sitting on a gold mine. If you watched Avatar, to be honest, this is the quintessential kind of look in a science fiction way at what indigenous groups go through during that process, right? There's this unobtainium mineral that the kind of earthlings are desiring after, and the indigenous group doesn't want to move off their homeland, right? Like, this is the struggle that still happens today. Indigenous groups hire lawyers and turn to the media along with non-governmental organizations for help. This is also where activist anthropologists' role come in as well. Whether it be David Graeber and Occupy Wall Street, whether it be anthropologists who have studied these groups that are being displaced. Those are all kind of key components here to shed light, give voice to some of these people that are being affected by this development and the development policies. Physical protests and political activism among indigenous have grown since the 1990s. Chiapas in Mexico, in South America, Amazon tribes. The video that I have you watch talks about how there is light shed on Texaco, and they end up paying a price for just going in and kind of messing things up and not doing what they were supposed to. And now that we have this, this would be one of those positive things about global media, is that they're able to shed light on these things, and really it is gonna give us the kind of the scope, but also more information when media and some of these other people go into these places, and these far off reaching places that we would never hear about if we didn't have that global media apparatus. Again, this is still happening all over Asia, Canada, US, right? South Dakota, Red Rock, the pipeline that was going in the kind of Lakota Sioux area of the Dakotas, it was going under their sacred ground, and they were protesting. So Australia, New Zealand, Latin America, all of these groups, all of these places have this issue still going on today. Women groups for change, NGOs, there's more and more women organizations that are coming about around kind of some of these issues. So it's not just like indigenous groups led by men. It's now indigenous groups or the women's voice is also playing a kind of a role in this aspect. So some fascinating kind of changes and shifts, obviously, since the 1990s. So some of the major issues, right? Like, I have a picture here of in terms of this is what fracking looks like, really, right? Development aggression, imposition of development projects and policies without free, prior, and informed consent of the affected people. This is usually how this goes, where people just come in and act like this is change and this is survival of the fittest. And if you're not strong, then you'll go away and we'll take what we need in order to progress or develop, right? So this is kind of your original kind of development component, is this development aggression piece. A life project, local people's definition of the direction they want to take it, take in life, right? Informed by their knowledge, history, and context. So getting people's life projects and getting their life stories out there in the media and or by anthropologists to shed light on these individual groups helps to also give a more complete picture of what's actually going on. And again, if we get a lot of these, let's say that there's a development proposed in a certain location, there's an indigenous group, and we get a bunch of life projects out of that group, it's really going to make that group come to life for the rest of the country or the world. And then that sheds light on things so that the people will not take advantage, and basically the development kind of stops right there. Extractive industry, this is what this is a picture of, is a business that explores, removes, processes, and sells minerals. That could be a good old-fashioned obsession with gold, silver, copper, precious metals, oil, gas found under the surface of the earth, non-renewable, right? So this is fracking. This is kind of the issue with this, is it moves to find kind of natural gas in certain locations. You've got to inject chemicals to basically break up the rock, and then the oil, you can pull it out after that. Where do we go for here? Cultural heritage sites. So this is a picture of Machu Picchu. They preserve and leads to identity, but harms local environments. So the tough piece here is, like, this is a tourist site, right? So millions of people visit Machu Picchu every year. And it's a beautiful thing. We've preserved it, and it brings an identity component back to culture. However, the problem is now we have 2 million people going to the site. So what happens is there's kind of this impact in terms of tourism. And a lot of times tourist locations like Acapulco or some of these other places, they blow up so big that then the pollution from the tourists starts to become so kind of impactful that people no longer go anymore. So actually Machu Picchu has started to limit their tourism because they see that. Future of cultural anthropology, as we become more global, questions of who we are will only increase. Who we are, where we come from, right? Like huge topics in that, like why do we ask the questions? Why is civilization so obsessed with this, this like reaching for the moon and building these monuments and having all this stuff? What is it in us that has shifted in the last 10,000 years, right? From this kind of being okay with minimal resources and being more okay with spending time with our loved ones and hanging out by the river and cooking and gathering food and, and being one with nature rather than being a taker. So some fascinating pieces here. I do believe anthropology will begin to study imagined future communities and kind of help with cultural rebuilding and formation, because anthropology is uniquely situated in terms of studying the past and the present. And we have like the most stories of any field of people and culture. I think that gives kind of credence to looking at the future and what the future should look like in terms of communities and culture groups and how we practice certain things from development all the way up through politics, right? Studying what it has been important. What about how can we live together as the next applied anthropology question, right? Like, how do we live together? Peace. It hurts me to think that peace has now become like an overused word that people don't strive for anymore. And especially because coming from an anthropologist's perspective, we had that for a long period of time. So I think that's kind of a very key component here. We can live together as like we did in the past, but maybe with some of the stuff that we have today. How do we mitigate that? That's kind of really kind of anthropologist's final question, I think. All right, so actually that's all that I have for the week. So again, questions, comments, concerns about the research paper or the course itself. I'm accepting late work, so if you have not gone back and redone a lot of the discussion posts and stuff that you've missed, you're going to want to do that, at least get half credit, don't lose out on those points. You're going to want to really try to focus in on turning everything in, because at the end of the day, each assignment adds up to like 1% of your grade, right? So that's key. And again, so